I think you can.
Sorry, we need one year and a half. So we've got 30 minutes left.
Yeah, so 5:30 is time, and then 5:45. So. Hi, folk. I was just saying we don't quite have enough microphones left in the room to go around, so please do come to the front half if possible, so you can hear us without amplification. We'll get started. Sure. Welcome all, and I would start by saying well done. It's been quite a week for everyone, and it's great to see the hardy folk who have made it through to Friday afternoon, early evening. My name's Dan Woodman. I'm a professor of sociology here, but I'm also the president of the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences that has been organising the Congress this week that's brought together all our associations, 22 in all. Before we get started on the panel, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land in which we're having our panel discussion today. I want to acknowledge and pay respect to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation, and also extend my respect to other Indigenous people who are present today in the room listening to the recording that we're going to put online later on. One of the associations taking part was the HASS, the Australian Sociological Association. As the sociologist, I've been able to get along to a couple of their events, and this morning their keynote was Professor Yves, who's an Aboriginal man of the Wakaya people of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and an Asian Anglo-Australian as well, and chair of race relations at Deakin University. He was speaking about colonisation and colonialism and post-colonial, decolonial thought today in his keynote. And he talked about dadiri, a concept about an inner kind of deep listening and being quiet, an awareness, a humbleness, and a reflexivity. The English word that's sometimes used to translate it is contemplation, but it at best only partly captures what the concept is about. But I thought, particularly in the context of the calls for voice and treaty, it was a concept that resonated with me as I thought about how I might acknowledge the people on whose lands I am an uninvited resident. So to start our panel today, I thought I'll introduce our speakers. So I've asked them here to talk about HASS, the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, and what role it has for our present and our future, more broadly as a society, as well as our universities. Our speakers are almost, I think, those that need no introduction, and to give them a fulsome and proper introduction would take so long that I'd finish the introduction and then say any questions before we wound up. So it's going to be very, very short introductions, but I'm sure you know of our speakers. So Dr. Yves Rees is a historian at Latrobe University, a writer and host of Archive Fever, and I'm sure many people in the room have read their memoir all about Yves, Notes from a Transition, that was published last year and was some lockdown reading for me, actually. Professor Zlatko Skrbis is a sociologist and Vice-Chancellor of Australian Catholic University. I definitely can't go through people's publications here. It'd take too long, but Zlatko is actually a sociologist of migration and also youth, which is my area. And we did once in a bigger team publish together, and I noticed that was not mentioned on any of the biographies I could find here online. at all.
I'm gonna raise that for history.
Professor Larissa Hjorth is an artist and digital ethnographer at RMIT, so a socially engaged artist, but I know her best as one of the co-founders of the Digital Ethnography Research Centre. So welcome. And Professor Maggie is Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Tasmania and part of the Europe Justice Commission here in Victoria. Maggie is a Palawa and has written widely around race relations broadly, but inequality and the work I know best around research methods and data sovereignty. So welcome. I thought I'd begin with a little bit of a biographical question for you all about how you ended up studying HASS subjects yourself and whether you see that as shaping where your life and work has gone since that point. Who would like to start? Maggie, would you like to?
I'm somebody who has a PhD, but I did not have grade 12. So I was an early school leaver and didn't leave my original BA from Charles Sturt University over 6 years while working full time, having 2 babies, and that was the time when you posted things. You lived on a farm in Yola, Tasmania. So the PhD was a bit of a doddle after that. So I started out trying to be a psychologist, and as I got into psychology and the individual focus, I thought this is not working for me. And I just took sociology subjects as filler, and the rest is history. I just went on from there and did social work again, and then did my PhD in sociology. And it's the best accident that ever happened.
Thank you. I've discovered sociology with a spare spot in my first year, and I wasn't great at it to begin with. I just barely passed my first essay, so I show my first year students this now and say, look, even if you scrape by, you might be teaching the class in 20 years' time. But I do promise them I'll drop better. Larissa.
Yeah, so I had started with visual arts, and I feel like that my story is a little bit like the woman that ate the slide, into the spider. And so I did visual arts, and I was like, wow, this is so gender problematic. And so then I went off and did women's studies, and then I was like, wow, they really, don't get culture. So then when I put down to politics, and then I was like, wow. And then I came across culture studies, like, wow. And I just wanted a bit of each. So that's what I ended up doing.
Speaking of visual culture, my children have a book that was one of my favourites to read to them when they were really little, which was the woman who ate the mozzie. She's
That's very topical at the moment.
Yeah,
I've got to say.
Yeah. Although you can definitely take a critical humanities lens to it if you go into it as well. So
That thing up there, we make the Aboriginal flag there.
Really?
Oh. Serendipity. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I decided I don't want to be a plumber. I was determined that I should be a plumber, and if I'm not good at that, I should be an electrician. So I somehow escaped my destiny. So I studied sociology and philosophy and sociology of culture, and then I did a PhD at Flinders in Australia. I'm first in family, and I was always curious about literature and great ideas, and so I landed in this space. Funny enough, just the conversation that was going on a moment ago, I failed my first introduction to sociology exam as an undergraduate student. It was my first exam ever, and I walked in, I was asked 2 questions, and I walked out again. Fail. So this was one of those opening statements that I used to make to first year introduction to sociology students as their lecturer. So
that's right. So it doesn't only mean that you can't be the lecturer of the class 20 years later. It also doesn't mean you're not going to end up vice chancellor.
You kind of a great fight.
You failed.
And what about you?
different story in that I sort of always knew I wanted to be a historian. I was quite the odd kind of outlier who did a BA after finishing high school, not because I just, you know, thought ideas were generally interesting and didn't know what else to do, but because I was quite vocationally focused on doing history. During high school, I'd won a National History Essay Writing Prize. And I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, there's this like thing called being a historian, and it's really fun because it combines like research, but also writing and storytelling and all these things I love kind of pulled together. So I was pretty driven on, you know, focused on doing history from word go. But then I suppose I kind of subsequently developed this second career as a creative writer and a kind of more creative practitioner, which I now kind of see as existing in parallel with my historical career. But I suppose both kind of fit under the HASS kind of umbrella. That's
a lovely segue. So maybe for my next question, we'll work back around the other way. But yeah, as I was saying, one of my readings that got me through those long weeks of long lockdown was your memoir, and it is a kind of work for a general audience, and you can see the kind of historical lens there. But I was saying before we started the panel that I also saw these touches of sociological imagination when you were talking about navigating some of the bureaucracy around name changes and other things, but also a kind of presentation of self-type work around when you were navigating getting recognized, and it made me think about the way that HASS knowledge and understanding might not just be about the grand challenges that all our universities put up on the website. You know, the same 6 grand challenges that are the unique mission of every university in Australia, but also maybe some of those challenges of everyday life in our contemporary world. I was wondering if you could say something about what you see the role of HASS being, maybe contributing to understanding and meeting some of the big or small challenges. Big question, I know.
I mean, I could answer that in 5 million different ways, I suppose. And I have a lot of thoughts on the big challenges, but I'll speak to the small challenges perhaps first. I think, you know, HASS disciplines inculcate a critical attitude to the world, which, you know, can, and in my case, certainly did fundamentally change my relationship to everyday life. I really think it was the fact of being an academic, being a historian, you know, being trained to think critically about the world that enabled me to come out as trans and kind of develop that critical relationship to gender, which I sort of write about in my memoir. And I think about this a lot in terms of undergraduate teaching, and I suppose, you know, coalition government's hostility to arts degrees. But, you know, I mean, I really strongly believe that, you know, studying the arts, studying HASS subjects, you know, teaches a critical thinking, which kind of undoes or, you know, develops a skepticism towards conservative truism. Like it's kind of inimical towards the sort of the platitudes of conservative ideology, and that, you know, conservative governments therefore want to deter people from doing arts degrees and developing that critical thinking as much as possible, and therefore raise, you know, student fees for those subjects as a result.
Zlatko, I know you also have some thoughts on jobs ready graduate package, and I wonder maybe in the context of saying something about these challenges, you might reflect on that.
Well, do you want us to plunge into policy at the moment? This is complex. I completely agree with what you just said. I just think that it was very successful. You know, I think there's been, over the last decade or so, there's been so much emphasis on job readiness, skills, professions of the future. And I must admit, I was having a hand in some of those projects myself. But really, I think we need to be very careful that we counterbalance that with something that will create a more rounded graduates. And for that, you need creative disciplines, social sciences, humanities, arts, that's right. And I think this is really quite interesting. So when you look at the enrollment numbers in through DESI dataset after job-ready graduates came out, we have actually seen an increase in applications for law, humanities, arts, commerce, and law in that area. And I think that's really fascinating. So I think the policy lever that they thought they are creating are actually genuinely not working. And if you step back, of course they are not working. You know, the current funding regime for higher education is based on the principle of delayed gratification. You know, so young people don't necessarily think a lot about their debt down the track, and they do follow their passion or their aspirations or their general inclinations. So I'm not surprised that it has failed. What I am more concerned about is that mental shift in public debate that has occurred over the last decade or so, where we are juxtaposing jobs and skills against everything else. And I think this is as dangerous a divide as the one that we tend to propagate sometimes between STEM and HASS. And it's, you know, it's a great source of excitement and activism, but I think we need to be very careful not to push that too far. So to round this up, I would say that the problem with job-ready graduates is that it's never delivered. And that's a good thing. But the other thing is that it's going to be very hard to actually dismantle it, because it's not like the new government can come in and say, we will dismantle this. The legislative apparatus that underpins job-ready graduates is so complex. It's so all-pervasive through different parts of legislation that the government simply cannot declare the end of job-ready graduates. It's just a massive undertaking. So we now have a massive problem as to how we divest ourselves of a policy that has never actually worked. But look, your original question was really about what contribution HASS can make. And there are so many different answers, and I'll just give you an outline with your permission. The first one is that, and what I'm going to say is something that we all like to say, and I think it's true, so it shall be repeated. I think if you're looking at wicked problems of today and tomorrow, you need a coalition, you need an alliance of all these different disciplines, and you cannot imagine that agenda moving forward without some significant input of HASS. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, for me as a Vice-Chancellor, I'm thinking about how can we continue to provide HASS content to our students. And I must say, we are doing quite well. We are counter-cyclical in so many different ways. We are investing quite heavily into HASS. And there are interesting reasons for that. But the reality is that I don't want us to go down the path of thinking about in a defeatist fashion about the future of HASS. I think if we go down that path, we will contribute to a bigger problem than already is. So. Larissa.
Okay, I've got the baton now. All right, I'm going to run. Okay, so I want to just take up what Yves was saying about what the past government had done in terms of trying to really it was setting HASS alight, and it was, I felt like I was watching a bushfire happening, and it was quite suffocating. It was very thick and pungent, and thank goodness Australia voted like it did, because it was really frightening what was happening in Australia. I mean, anyone that looks at the US and sees what's happened over the decades, by the fact that they tried to get rid of critical creative thinking, which is, we know that the jobs of the future, that is one of the core basic skills that is going to be needed, and yet the very the very disciplines that nurture that and create that were being destroyed. So that, so thank goodness Australia got it how they did. Phew, we can be a little bit more optimistic, but I mean, the point that you were making was that this has been a long project. And so this is deep in its deep structural, organizational, how we think. And so it's not going to change overnight. But I think there is a kind of difference between the affect and the representation. So I just want to use the example of what happened recently with the dictated Dan situation, where we had press that was saying Dan's not going to get in, Dan is evil, everyone really hates Dan, and Dan got in. And wow, and it really showed a disconnect, and you can really see that what was happening with the Murdoch press stuff is really what has been happening with the Liberal government, in a sense. It has lost contact with people. So in terms of that kind of, that's just one thing I just want to put out there but in terms of big challenges, I mean, I think, which big challenges do you want to pick? It's like mega. But I think HASS does have a really good, the kind of challenges that we're looking at, like the climate emergency, Indigenous sovereignty, which I know that you're going to talk about some of them. The datification of the world, and we haven't even thought through the ramifications of a lot of things that are going to happen with data, like what happens with, in 5 years' time, there's more data of the dead online than there is of living. What are we doing in terms of legacy issues, rights, copyright, blah, blah. There's so many big issues, but actually it is HASS that is perfectly placed to deal with those, because we know how to deal with the messiness of the social. We know how to bring those really inventive methods that look at tacit stuff and give visibility to tacit stuff, and really think through the kind of the methods, the techniques, etc., to kind of really give voice to them. And that's what we need, because a lot of the challenges that we have are really, really complex social challenges. And a lot of those complexities haven't been given voice. And that's why I think, as bleak as things look at the moment, I think HASS can deal with it. We can fix it, we've got tools. We were all going to be plumbers once, but we have redirected to.
Now we have words.
We have words, and we know how to use them. We have pens as well, and we have computers.
It's funny you mentioned those tools and theories. And speaking of the troubles of everyday life, there's lots of advantages that have been given to Dan, so over time, I would say, but one of the disadvantages was that there's a lot of them. I was looking at some of the data from birth, deaths and marriages, and the year I was born, which is just a few years after that other Dan, it was the #1 name across the whole country. So the problem I had was being one of 4 Dans in my class. When I was in year 3 and 4, there was a Daniel Small in my class, so I got to be Daniel Tall for a few years until I was growing up. Yes. Maggie, we'll shift.
I want to continue on, because I want to make a talk about HASS as well.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you while you talked about HASS. When I was preparing this, I was listening to your Fay Gale Memorial Lecture with the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, where you talked about the data sovereignty, and there was kind of 2 central premises. One is the rights of Indigenous nations over data about them, regardless of who has it, but also the right to data for Indigenous people to support nation rebuilding. So as we think about these big and small challenges that HASS might help us deal with, could you add in something about how we might be going with beginning to recognise some of those rights, or work a little bit better on some of those questions?
Going okay and going terribly. So I have a beef with HASS, and I have a beef especially with social sciences, and I love social sciences, so this is coming from a place of love. There was a big colonisation-shaped hole in the Australian Academy, where we do not talk about colonisation, and we do not talk about colonisation being the base on which this society was founded and is founded. So you will not find a definition of colonisation in any sociology textbook, but my favourite definition is the one from the Mosbacher family on White Lotus, and they define colonisation as you come in, you kill people, you take their country, and then you make them dance. And that pretty well sums up what happens here. And I frequently feel I'm being asked to dance. In many of the things, the level of engagement is really, for most of the HASS, is about making us dance. So for social sciences, my big critique is to say, what is the point of a discipline whose whole point is to describe and explain the society in which it is based, which completely ignores the foundation of that society and the impact that that has on every single one of us, whether you're First Nations, whether you came out here post-colonisation, or you've come out in the last century. So I really am very, very frustrated that sociology still, and much of the social sciences, act like we're in England and just completely ignore that we're actually in Australia. So that's my big beef. And we've just finished our Handbook of Indigenous Sociology, and I wrote the chapter that says the case for the cancellation of sociology. Kahu talked me down. I'm not right, but she talked me down to more calling the discipline to account. But it is, I think, as Indigenous sociologists, we're all fed up. Most of us won't come to TASA and things anymore, mostly because we're sick of being in the special cupboard. We're not interested in being in the special cupboard. We've now got places like NASA, American Indigenous Studies Association, and that's where we all go, because there are places where we feel we're doing decent work, rather than get stuck at the 6 o'clock slot over the other side of the campus. So that's my beef. Data sovereignty, yes, we've made a big step forward. We've got, everybody's applied to wanting to do research in Indigenous places now. You have to go by the IACS Code of Ethics, which has data sovereignty very well built into it. The closing the gap refresh built-in data into Pillar 4. Government's all signed off on it. They have no idea what they signed up to. Bad luck. They've signed the memorandum. They now have to implement it and actually do exactly that. What you were talking about before, Dan, the two sides of data governance. It's governance of data, the 5D deficit data that currently exists, and it's just a data of surveillance. We just sort of say it's it's like a pulse check on colonisation. Still the poorest, tick. Still the least employed, tick. Still the least educated, tick. Still the most dispossessed, tick. Things are good. We've got a mark again. So things are happening very much at the national level and in the public service, with things around data sovereignty and certainly within research as well, but with a long way to go.
Now, I might come back to you soon, seeing you've decided to not call for the abolition of sociology just yet, to ask maybe where you see a future that could be different. But maybe I'll frame that by asking Zlatko, when I was doing my preparation, I was reading your inaugural lecture at ACU, and you were talking about your one of your first HASS subjects, where you spent an entire semester reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and made it through 40 pages very slowly, and it was a way you were talking about the importance and the joy and the importance of learning that close reading. But it did also make me think about maybe that kind of vision people have is some of the critiques coming both from Maggie, but also for jobs ready graduate, about what HASS education looks like. And I do think that there's a place for learning to sit with text, but I'd like you and maybe the panel to reflect on what does the future of how we do HASS education look like?
I'm happy to start. What you're referring to is my introduction to German classical philosophy class, which sounds really exciting. And yes, although the preface to the Phenomenology of Mind is 40 pages long, we never kind of graduated from the first paragraph. That was the joy of it. So we were kind of stuck with the first and second sentence. But the point is, that for me, that was a turning point. I just couldn't believe what the lecturer was doing to us. I mean, we were literally transformed and completely mesmerized by the ideas that were coming out during those lectures. And at my first lecture, that was before I failed my first sociology exam, I've decided that I want to do to others what he has done. Now, I've never achieved that glory, may I say, not that I know, but it was a turning point for me. But I think there is a deeper lesson in this, and I'm glad that you are challenging that kind of story that I told in the inaugural lecture, because for me, there is always a place for a monastic humanities scholar. But I know that there must be more than that. I'm just really worried if text remains the world, all-encompassing world that we occupy. So look, I think the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what should good humanities learning and teaching look like today? And I don't have a simple answer to that. But surely we don't want to take all that enchantment that I'm describing in my inaugural lecture, take away. But we do need to be nimble, and I think we do need to be slightly more modern than in those times. But frankly, I think anything that inspires minds to think beyond what is in front of them is a good thing, and nothing can give you that better than HASS, I would say.
Yves, would you like to jump in?
I suppose I would approach this question kind of returning to some of Maggie's comments about the need to decolonize knowledge, really. I mean, I think, with my colleagues at Latrobe, we've been having a lot of conversations about, how not only can we, bring in, Indigenous content, get our students to constantly reckon with the fact that we're on stolen land, and that has, innumerable implications, but also to kind of build into our curriculum and our pedagogy an acknowledgement that the HASS disciplines were a key part of the colonial project in Australia, and so-called Australia and other settler colonial nations. That, I think we still, we kind of well-meaning white academics like to think of ourselves as these kind of, the good guys, doing knowledge production, but we are, the inheritors of, and still contribute to a knowledge system of people who very much have blood on our hands. And I more and more think that's what we need to be doing, like to be thinking about and talking about with our students. That yes, HASS thinking gives really wonderful critical tools and ways of thinking and knowing that can be emancipatory, but we also need to be acknowledging the history and the present of the way in which those tools have been used in oppressive, colonising ways. And, and I think students are really hungry for that approach. Like, we've started to do that at Latrobe, and there's a lot of excitement about that.
I might say the last word for you, Maggie, on this one. So, Larissa, I'll have to put you in between.
Well, I suppose I just wanted to pick up on just thinking about, because I mean, I completely agree with what has been said. And I suppose I just wanted to think about what learnings we can take from the pandemic in terms of education, because I think what we, having not taught for quite a while and then going back into teaching when it was all online, was a really interesting learning experience for me, insofar as it really showed me what, as somebody who works a lot in digital media, actually what the limits of the digital is in terms of the kind of different, imparting different and having that kind of learning experience. I realised just how much I failed constantly on Teams, on Canvas or whatever, because, I realised I was quite a kind of kinesthetic person in terms of that's what I think is really powerful when you have those moments, those learning moments where you actually are present, and it's really hard to be present on digital media, and it's really you know, you're kind of flicking while you're looking at White Lotus to bring it back on. It's such a great, you know, like picking it up as a citation, because it is, it's like a fantastic deconstruction of the whole white privilege there. Oh, wow. You know, but you know, people are like, they're looking on their mobiles at the same time as they're looking at the screen. Like, we're all so distracted, and yet we're so overwhelmed, and we're so fatigued, and we've all got disenfranchised grief and unanticipated, you know, kind of futures grief, and all those kind of heavy, complex things that just being on a screen and experiencing teaching those kind of contexts is just not going to cut it. So I think it's really interesting, because I think it's called for the fact that we do need classroom, we do need physical classrooms, and that embodied learning experience is so fantastic for HASS, because it is really about that messiness of the social that actually embodied learning needs to. So I think that's just a slightly different angle, but I just wanted to bring it back, because I think we do have, as cruel as the pandemic has been, it's actually given us a lot of insight into what was going to be potential futures. Like, everyone was like, yeah, well, we can just go digital and we can cut budgets and everyone can just, you know, and it's not going to work like that, because it's actually highlighted how complex knowledge exchange is. And actually, if we're going to do the decolonialisation project properly, it can't happen on Zoom. It's just not going to.
That's very interesting. I'll come back to that with you, Larissa, but first we'll go over to Maggie. So
I'm somewhere in between. So I'm going to say, please don't colonise, please indigenize, because you can't decolonise.
And you have, yeah, thanks.
And it never comes neutral. So, but like Zlatko, I have been excited when I've read books. The books of, you know, like I love Bourdieu, Sociological Imagination really made me sit up and, you know, and take notice, and I would hate us to lose that. And I think also to make the point that indigenising doesn't mean throwing out Bourdieu or Hegel, or there are important theoretical, they make important points that are useful, but they do need to be decoupled from their colonising linkage. At the same time, I know that these things aren't speaking, you know, when I first started teaching Soc A, you know, it's not going to come back to that. And we did a course, a couple of, which is still going, called the Indigenous Love World, where we actually we tried indigenising properly, and we actually had made lots of film with people doing virtual tours of country and people speaking. And that was a lot of work, but it worked. And I think it's good, but at the same time, if you're not getting people to get that thrill where they read that sentence, it suddenly hits them like a bolt between the eyes. And so, you know what it's like, it tilts your world on its foundation. All of a sudden you think, I'm seeing the world differently than I was 10 seconds ago. I would hate to lose that as well.
I think that's a nice segue again, or I'll try to make it work. That's kind of my job, really. So there was a good reflection there, I think, on the way things need to change a lot, but still that value of when the world can be tilted on its head. Larissa, I was struck because when I was preparing, I was having a look at your book with Kathleen Kaminsky, Haunting Hands. You know, as a digital ethnographer who's written about how social media can kind of help through periods of loss and grief, to hear you talking about how you can't do teams, you got to be in the room with people. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear about your reflections about our digital media age some more, but more broadly, I'd ask the panel to reflect looking forward. What can HASS do in terms of helping us live through, make sense of, rebuild from the periods of loss and grief that I think some people in so-called Australia have a long history of facing, but those of us who maybe don't have had a tough couple of years at least here in Victoria and other places. So how HASS might help us deal with those periods of loss and grief that we live through, but also maybe give us some hope for a different future? Another big question. Sorry.
Well, actually, I just happened to give a talk at the cultural studies. So, I mean, I think, so the talk that I gave at the Cultural Studies Conference was about thinking about trying to kind of coalesce these different types of griefs, which have different depths. And so there's the eco-grief kind of work that's happening around the kind of, the kind of almost existential crisis around what we're seeing in terms of the climate emergency and what it's doing and what it's then doing to our sense of self in the world, and that kind of sense of homesickness when we're at home because it's no longer the lands that being lived on. Then there's coupled with the intergenerational grief or deep trauma that has been experienced by First Nations people, and that we are all carrying it in our own way because it is all pervasive. So there's that. Then there's the kind of pandemic, what David Kessner talks about in terms of those kind of unanticipated futures griefs. So a lot of people, and you can see it generationally having different impacts. So, you know, the kind of kids who were studying and just finishing 11 year 12 and for them to do all of that in Victoria online, and then to be thinking about like, what am I going to be studying next when the planet's going to be blowing up thanks to everybody who's got their foot on the accelerator to climate hell and they're not doing anything. So there's a lot of different layers and depths and histories of grief that aren't just individual, even though grief is talked about. I mean, its definition is about the individual process and it is experienced by everybody differently. But it's when we think about it as a mourning ritual, which is where you do get that mourning as a social, cultural, political ritual, that's where people come together, because that's where through those rituals people can actually have some sense of the different layerings of grief. And I think what we're seeing now is attempts to make some new mourning rituals, and these are building on previous mourning rituals. So it's a constant, it's like it's a rehearsal. We're rehearsing life, and as we go along, we go, oh, that morning ritual didn't quite work out right, that I didn't feel a great bonding there, you know. So it's a constant, every time we go through it, we are trying to learn to do death better, do grief better, do mourning better, ideally. And there is some really interesting work happening, particularly with, you know, creative practitioners and the creative resilience space. So there's things like Creative Resilience Lab, led by Jen Ray, and Indigenous speculative feminist writer Claire Coleman, who, you know, they are really rehearsing this climate hell now for people to really think through where are we going, why are we going, can we do something, you know. So because it is quite easy to feel very despondent and great despair and just go, I'm just going to drink myself to death. I can't do anything, you know, just kill 8 million koalas, etc. You know, that kind of, so I think this is where HASS actually has the capacity to build new imaginaries around how we could actually embed hope. And it's really interesting when you read all the stuff in the eco-grief space, they're constantly bringing back that it's a paradox between the great levels of grief and mourning and hope. That through mourning and that we creating ritual, that we become hopeful again, because we're reminded of what makes humans good rather than what makes humans suck. So, was that, sorry, I'm not.
No. I love the highly technical terms that stuff.
Very technical.
So maybe Zlatko, do you have some sense of what HASS can tell us about what makes us suck and what makes us good?
I'm slightly less Dickensian about
Right.
this, because no, that's all right. I think you're bringing a very, very legitimate and really insightful perspective. I suppose from my point of view, and that is, I suppose what I would be saying is that, you know, people have an innate need to understand points of departure, the present, and they want to imagine the future. So I think that I really like your juxtaposition between grief and hope, because I think unless we think both at the same time, we get stuck in hopelessness. And I think we are inherently built, this terrible language, but to hope, to dream, to imagine and reimagine. And HASS gives us those devices. You know, we are in need of stories that kind of try and explain those connections between, you know, point of departure or source of pain, grief, and how we get out of it. You know, there are artistic expressions, there are ways of transcending that pain and questioning. And that's what makes humanities so durable, so existentially necessary. What I think is a bigger problem is that we have a generation of young people now emerging that are, to great extent, and this is a pessimist in me, bereft of some of the tools that you would get through that humanities discourse. And this is why we need more humanities, not less. That's why we need to actually find meaningful ways of balancing, bringing humanities into some of those spaces. So my primary lens, the difference between you and me, I suppose, is that my primary lens is hope. For some others, and I'm not suggesting that that's for you, a primary lens is the opposite of it. You know, it's that point of departure that triggers pain.
But aren't they companions?
Exactly, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Maggie, maybe we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I think, you know, humanities and social sciences, I mean, have given me the tools, which I love, to actually think, why is society like this? Why is it so bad? And then to be able to make sense of it. Because if you can't make sense of it, you can't imagine a different future, and you certainly can't plan how you get to a different future. So I do a lot of grounding in my sociology, but you know, it's not where I want to be, but I think it's necessary to bring people on to get to actually get social sciences to open up more generally than they have been, that there is still, and it's not just Indigenous stuff, but that's my area, where cupboards are still closed. And there is a lot of grief, there's huge amounts of grief. I went to the Chatham Turvey thing, and, you know, people were right along the street, and, you know, for all of us, you know, you don't have to be Cassie's street relative to feel that pain, and to know that it's just a continuation of pain continuing. But at the same time, I'm now a member of a commissioner on a Truth and Justice Commission. I was part of the Uluru dialogues. That was one of my, you know, the biggest thing that ever happened to me was to go to Uluru and part of that. And so I can see a different future, and sociology actually gives me the tools to actually imagine how that would go. And I certainly, as a Justice Commissioner, bring my sociological thinking to the way that we're going about our business. And so I think that's where we are needed in those spaces. And I think with critical thinking, because you can't box it up and you can't see it, it's pretty easy to dismiss it. But you know, when you meet somebody who hasn't got critical thinking skills, well, not you.
Yves, the last word on this one, as a historian, about understanding those periods of loss and trauma and also hope. And
yeah, I suppose I have my own kind of grief-based crisis of confidence about these kind of questions 4 or 5 years ago, when I sort of really, you know, about the time the IPCC put out that report in 2018, I think we've got 12 years left. And that was sort of a moment for me where I thought, God, I've only got 12 years left. You know, I'm wasting my time being an academic and doing history, and it all seems a bit frivolous and, you know, remote. And I sort of, you know, really did a lot of soul searching and reading and thinking about these questions about the relationship between HASS and the climate crisis and various other crises. And in that process, I suppose I found two thinkers that I've kind of, you know, continue to return to as my anchors in kind of reminding me why HASS is so important. The first is a historian called Paul Kramer, a historian based in the US, who he kind of had his own crisis of faith in response to Trump being elected. You know, and he wrote this essay in early 2017 when one of his PhD students sent him an email saying, you know, I don't want to be like one of those people who did nothing in the 1930s. You know, I'm dropping out of my PhD and I'm going to go and like fight on the streets. And Paul Kramer was thinking, you know, what do I say in response to this student? And he sort of comes up with like 3 key ways in which, you know, history in particular, but I think HASS more generally, is useful in these times of crisis. And his 3 ways are first that the kind of critical thinking disrupts inevitabilities, you know, this idea that, you know, we're doomed for a climate emergency, you know, we must live in a society where Indigenous people are subordinated, all these things that are so, or, you know, that capitalism is the only way of organising the economy, all these taken for granted ideas. His second point is that HASS thinking builds empathy, because it's about understanding difference, telling stories that put you in the shoes of another, and kind of building bridges across different communities. And his third argument is that it provides, particularly history, kind of provides a storehouse of ideas about how to live in the world differently. He calls historians archaeologists of the road not taken. And I love that metaphor that we kind of dig down and we find kind of ideas that weren't quite ready to exist, but provide kind of, you know, forms of inspiration of how we can live in the world differently. So Paul Kramer and his 3 things are kind of one of my touchstones. And the other is Rebecca Solnit, who I think writes really beautifully about the importance of narrative and storytelling as a form of political activism and political protest. She has many quotable lines on this point, but one of them is that, you know, the change that counts in revolution happens first in the imagination. And of course, you know, revolutions are material, structural things, and, you know, they involve more than words and stories. But I do think that point holds, that imaginative change counts first. And that's what we work with. We work with stories in people's minds. And so that's why I continue to think our work matters.
On that note of our work mattering, I did want to maybe bring the audience into the conversation now, because you are Star Wars who made it to the end of this very long week of HASS. So you deserve an opportunity to ask a few questions. So we'll start at the front here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much. What strikes me is actually in contrast that this is a brilliant panel compared to perhaps the earlier panel, which I was very disappointed about in terms of the value of the arts and arts skills. I wrote those speeches 20 years ago for the Vice-Chancellor, you know, and that wasn't on postgrad day. That was, you know, sort of an invitation for an experienced practitioner. And I thought, you know, why haven't we changed the narrative in the humanities and the social sciences? So perhaps you want to comment on that.
Why haven't we changed the narrative?
Well, you know, we're still talking about, you know, retailing, you know, the arts, you know, in terms of the skills that they get, and not talking about what you people have been talking about, which is brilliant, which is about the angst, the existential crisis, having to live through gaining the degree and then trying to find our path in the world afterwards.
Anyone like to respond about why the narrative has been stuck, maybe?
I agree, it has been stuck. And I've gone to TASA conferences where they announce the name of the forthcoming conference. I think navel gazing, you know, it's and I think that's maybe the essential problem, is that we're so focused in on maybe selling and looking at ourselves instead of actually doing what we should be doing as practitioners in HASS and getting out and change. We're supposed to be changing the world. That's our job.
Yes.
Colleagues, so no, please go ahead. This is a difficult question, actually. This is a genuinely difficult question, and I don't think there is a simple answer to it. And I think all of us would possibly have a different inflection on the question. It's interesting because I haven't been to any of these TASA conferences now for about 8 to 10 years. And I know, looking at the program, that it's pretty much the same, should I say. Different people, better people, I would say, exciting people. But I think there is a paradigm within which we operate. And I think unless we can self-reflexively unleash the creative forces within our community, I think we will continue to struggle. I think from my point of view, and this is very much my position, the older I get, the more holistic I like to see humanities and arts and social sciences projects. So for me, it is quite unsatisfying to encounter a program of conference proceedings that compartmentalize different issues, whether it's Indigenous or gender or art or whatever class, whatever it can be. For me, the most powerful impact on my thinking as a sociologist have been works that kind of straddle the novelistic and sociological, because they so well explain the phenomenon that I thought was worth exploring. And I just feel that we are lacking imagination to be bolder and different. And I think that's a real shame, because, and I think we were skirting around the issue around what's the purpose of what we do? Is it self-referential? Is it, you know, is it activism, or is it impact, or whatever we call it? And I feel really comfortable talking about these things. But I know, as a sociologist, as I was developing, we always were looking for those handrails to define that helped us define our presence and help us define our particular angle on phenomena that we were interested in. And I think that's really sad and constraining. Now, with the benefit of age, I suppose, I look back and I feel really disappointed with myself. And I address that by kind of skirting around different issues, from nationalism, migration, to cosmopolitanism, you know, social theory. And I really found all of that really liberating, just jumping into something else. But I do think that it would be really a fantastic challenge to a sociological community, or a HASS community more broadly, to actually encourage us to think slightly differently, because marvelous things could come out of it. But it does take a different paradigmatic approach to it. And that's what we are doing pretty badly. And that's what actually, if I may be slightly provocative, just to get the conversation going, I think that's the vulnerability of the HASS project now. We are being withdrawn the license because we have not changed. And I think that's the problem. And I don't think it's necessarily because we haven't become more activist or more this or more that, but because we haven't become more wholesome in the way in which we integrate our perspectives.
So I agree, yes. The point I think in terms of that, why the narrative hasn't changed, is that I think we have become more interdisciplinary, but the way in which, for example, the conferences frame doesn't speak to the truth of what we do in terms of methods. So, and I'm thinking of like what happens, say, there's a lot of really great Canadian scholars doing this thing that they call research creation, which is predominantly comes from sociology, but it's like they are bringing in people from theatre, and it's all about this idea of knowledge generation and exchange. And about those kind of sites of like knowledge transmission in really, really interesting ways where it is about, I mean, those kind of projects are much more about those non-traditional outputs, which are less output driven and are actually about like, what happens if we take ideas and knowledge for a walk, and what happens when we do it with community, not for community, but with community? What happens to that? And there's so much of that exciting stuff, but it actually isn't being really captured accurately. And so the books that have really inspired me are, like, say, the work that kind of came out of Goldsmith's, God bless, Goldsmith is burning at the moment. Anyway, the people like Celia Lurie and Nina Wakefield, their book Inventive Methods, which, you know, like that to me was like so gold sociology, you know, like what they were doing with like what Les Black does with taking the cassette tape and making us rethink infrastructures through cassette tape. And, you know, there are so many interesting ways in which the techniques we're using, the methods that we're using are fascinating, and the way that they're being packaged for that story actually isn't capturing what the impactful things that they're doing. So it is about maybe the genre of how those stories are being captured is no longer the right format for it or something. Yeah.
I really agree with everything you said. I think particularly about the kind of sense of spaces in the humanities project and the need to reinvent. But I suppose where my brain goes when we kind of think about that point is, I suppose, the university structures that inhibit more imaginative and bold thinking. You know, I'm thinking of the way in which academic careers are very, you know, metric driven increasingly, and, you know, certain types of academic outputs are more valuable, like traditional journal articles are often more valued than non-traditional research outputs and more interdisciplinary and creative modes of expression. And I also think about, you know, the increasing casualisation and precarity of academia, particularly for junior academics, and how that really, you know, limits research time for creative thinking and reflection when you're doing, you know, multiple different short-term teaching contracts just to try and survive. So I think, you know, these are problems of imagination, but these are also structural problems. We need to give people time and money to do thinking. I think we need to change, you know, the way the economies of universities are organised to allow that exciting, important research to happen.
Yes, up here now.
You hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
So I'm How from Ziken, PhD candidate. I did my undergrad accountants and help me get complex studies. So I had so many like small moments in my study back then, which steered me towards what I'm now, which is in queer and youth studies and also philosophy. And now I'm back here in tutoring. I just want to know, how can we create more, even like facilitate more moments like that, which inspire me a lot, our students in our class, and to facilitate them to kind of encourage them not to only pursue academia, but to become wherever they want to be as students.
So many pathways and pathways that aren't just in one direction. And yeah, so would someone like to get us started on how we might facilitate that for our students?
Okay, I'll give it a go. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the subject that I taught recently was a studio-ish subject. So I was lucky because it wasn't one of those 101s where you got to go out and do that. I feel like you have to do the jazz and car salesperson kind of thing when you're doing those 101 big classes. But when you've got like a studio elective where you can actually connect really to people, I always like to kind of spin a little bit what the assignment that you're supposed to do and think about it a little bit in terms of, you know, even getting them to do interesting stuff on their mobile phone. So one of the assignments that I set them was like, go through your phone and find an image that to you represents the pandemic, like your experience of the pandemic, and then talk through it. And it was so insightful, and the penny dropped for so many of them, because half my students were actually in mainland China under horrific circumstances. They were trapped in their home with parents in a small apartment that wasn't supposed to have people living there 24/7. And it was really, really, really hard for them. And this gave them a way to kind of create those stories to actually think about possibilities again. And so I think putting the kind of story mechanism spin in there allows people to find perhaps their own voice or their own way through. And so I think less of the exam kind of models and more of the kind of, you know, exercises that get them to do that, taking ideas for a walk, and especially through, particularly given the pandemic, and so many people have had those really trapped at home. I watched too much White Lotus moments, but you know, like it could be, this can be a really powerful way of through that sense-making mechanism. And I'm thinking, because Peter Murray's in the room here, wrote a piece about like journal writing over the pandemic and how there was a real rise in people writing journals, and that is that sense-making mechanism. And I think the more that we can attune our methods to that sense-making, getting them to do that sense-making, gets them to do that kind of critical thinking really in really quite vibrant ways that allow them to feel vitality, which they're not really feeling much. Great question.
Anyone like to add?
I'll say something critical about, so no, not about you.
No, you'll see next week.
Quite like the argument, but I think, you know, from again, just speaking as an administrator, arts folks, HASS folks are really bad at telling a good story about the value of HASS. And that never ceases to surprise me, quite frankly. You know, when you actually, I work with lots of consultants, and majority of them are not business analysts, as most people would think about. They're just straightforward arts graduates. So surely arts graduates have something that is, you know, tradable on the job market. I just think that we, you know, and again, what you can see what I'm trying to do today with my arguments. I'm just trying to lift us up to, you know, shift degrees of freedom, really, in a way in which we think about what HASS can do, because I think there is a whole plethora of career and fulfillment opportunities for students who are actually studying in arts society kind of cluster. And I think we are not telling that story really well. So I think we need to loosen up a little bit in terms of what it means to study in our disciplines and what the future can look like. But can I also say that I genuinely believe that there is space for a whole spectrum of HASS engagement, from monastic writing, which results in beautiful volumes that are then, that New York reviews, review books reviews, to some really practical, implementable, exciting, life-changing stuff. So on Wednesday, I was in Ballarat, for example, and we were having a community industry forum. And we were celebrating the fact that we won 3 PhD scholarships that were granted by local arts organizations and Ballarat City, Ballarat City, to support investigation into local arts and museum areas. And how fantastic, how tremendously impactful that is going to be. So you capture the best of you know, theoretical and conceptual, and practical, implementable, and consequential. And I think that's great. That's not the only way to do it, but it is great. And I think for universities, I'm absolutely in agreement with you that we have challenges in terms of the way in which we structure things. And it's always been thus. I mean, listening to you, you know, 20 years ago, I was saying exactly the same thing. But it's always been thus. I guess what we need to think about, how can we actually give more productive voice within the institutions? And to be honest, it's really hard to work with HASS folks. It really is. They're great people, but it is often very, very difficult to actually develop a coalition that helps us lift their game.
Okay, players.
Well, there are different ways of explaining that. I'm just giving you a gentle nudge that it's sometimes the community itself is not helping the cause.
Did I see a question in front? Yeah.
This is potentially going back to data issues about that. Recently was going through the ethics process, which is a process in itself. And I came across this shift that's happened toward making data open access as a blanket term, as it should be open access rather than as a statement. And I see for the humanities, it's like I'm doing transcripts with trans people and not making my transcripts open access. Like, so I was wondering how we like potentially engage with an approach. Like, I think there's benefits, but where that kind of sits for HASS.
So you know how good white bread is, you know how good motherhood is. Well, data availability is evidently in the same category. Runs all around the world that somehow if you open up data, and I'm including in that transcripts from interviews and things, not just purely the statistical data, and of course the numbers represent something. They're not just numbers, they represent people and people's lives. There is this wonderful belief system that if you open it all up, you allow all these people to come in and you get different answers that will solve all our social problems. So it's this naive but harmful belief that open data is good data. I love data, and I think, you know, people accessing data and doing analysis is wonderful, but opening it up just the risk is so big. Personally, we've been involved in our Ngara Indigenous data sovereignty, sending submissions to the federal government and the data commissioner saying, please put in some Indigenous specific protections. Promise. Data availability Act came out in June 22. The word Indigenous is not in the Act at all. So I just shudder that the sort of, it's an ideology, and it's almost like people have drunk the Kool-Aid to believe that opening it up is always a good thing. So just for a quick example, I went into the Queensland open data portal because it's all administrative data from government departments. There was a data set on there that had people's drug and alcohol when they've been in a drug and alcohol rehab thing and what drugs they were there for, what treatments they got. It had, evidently it was confidentialised, but it had whether they were Aboriginal, whether they were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or whether they were Torres Strait Islander. It had their postcode. It had their age in a 5-year age thing. And I said, you know, I could, there's a Torres Strait Islander woman from just out of Townsville. I could make 2 phone calls in the community and find out who that is. And it's a real worry, and you know, we can do these things right. I don't know why we do them wrong every single time. So please, yeah, guard those transcripts. Don't let somebody who doesn't understand the topic get their hands on them because they're interesting.
All data is cooked, as they say. So it's like there's no such thing as raw data. But it is, I mean, it's really, it's this whole thing about, I mean, I get the open access thing. I think because of the idea that, you know, we're in knowledge production and it's about getting it out there to the public. But as researchers, we have responsibilities to our participants I'm always amazed how much excessive data I make when I do a project, even though I think I'm being really streamlined in my methods. there's always moments where you move in the research, because if you're listening to the field, you will move, because the question that you go in is going to change. So I'm always doing ethics amendments, etc. But I mean, your point about like that the data can often be re-identified. I mean, like, look what's just happened with Optus and then Medibank. Did we not learn anything about like this kind of storing of data? Like, we really are still just learning the way in which data can be contextualized constantly. And you know what happens when, you know, people like so some of the work that I've been looking at is like the digital legacy associated kind of work, which is all about like what happens to people when they die, and then those images get used in ways that were never meant to be used in those ways. So I think we really are in very infant steps in terms of understanding what are the ramifications of data and data open access dimensions. And so we need to, as researchers, question back and push back on those sort of things and give those comments. Like, I think we do, that's what it's a great privilege to work with participants, and we need to honour that and honour them. And that's how we do that, by taking care of the data in careful ways.
Now, unless you want to add something, we probably have time for take one more question. Yeah. Someone, okay. Last one here.
I'm going to direct this question to our guest Vice-Chancellor, whose name I didn't quite catch. So sorry about that. But as I'm sure you know, over the last 25 years, there's a tremendous body of literature of what people are calling the corporate, neoliberal, entrepreneurial enterprise university. And from my reading of this literature, in the corporate university, those faculties and those disciplines that most directly feed into a profit-making endeavor, such as in business and economics, and engineering, medicine, perhaps law, are the most rewarded, best rewarded, and the arts, the social sciences, humanities, where you find more of a critical edge, they are sort of marginalized. We see that with what happened at UWA, the solution of sociology and anthropology programs. And in the corporate university, you have a managerial approach where senior managers are basically calling the shots. And at the bottom of the heap, you have casuals that we refer to, who are precariat and are sometimes subject to wage theft. So what do social scientists, academic sociologists, anthropologists like myself, how do we deal with this? Do we just sort of sit back and accept this structure? Or do we have to have a house revolution?
The Vice-Chancellor, I do not want more revolutions in my life. But look, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. I think, you know, I'm certainly aware of the literature that you're referring to. The reality is, and I can tell you as a Catholic university, you know, I like to say no money, no mission. That's the reality. We need to keep our university afloat, as it were, you know, and we are balancing many different priorities in so many different ways. For us, I'm speaking about my university, you know, we have an advantage that it is our mission to protect some of those areas that fall into HASS category. So we are anti-cyclical in that sense. That doesn't mean that we may not at some point have to make certain decisions and so on and so forth. But the reality is all vice-chancellors have to, or all managers in universities need to balance a lot of competing priorities. There is lots of mythology around how we go about this. So for example, medicine is a bottomless pit for money. Medicine brings a lot of prestige, but doesn't bring any money. not much money. You know, I think the reality is we are working under very difficult and complex, within a very difficult and complex environment. And I can say for myself, at least, that I'm always trying to make sure that wherever we land, that we land optimally and that we do least damage. And frankly, that's a bit of a motto of mine, because, you know, you get pressured from all sides and then you have to jump somehow. And so I think what is important is elements of cooperativism, if I pronounce that properly, are there. Those elements are there because we are governed, we are regulated, we have to report, we have to account for, and so on. But I think there are degrees of freedom that we have to do things right. But let me tell you, and this is my personal comment, it's not easy. It genuinely isn't easy because of those complex environments within which we operate, and because of those competing pressures that we need to satisfy. I wish it was different, but it is not. And, you know, having said that, sometimes out of a crisis, good things happen. I was talking to my colleague from UW, formerly UWA, Farida. Yes, you know, they did a lot of damage to themselves in terms of shutting down anthropology and sociology. But there is still a little seed of anthropology perhaps remaining, which may blossom down the track. But the colleagues from that university have done quite well out of it. You know, they've moved to other places, they are re-energized, they're going to contribute to their agenda in different places. So I like to look at these things in a fairly, through a dynamic landscape perspective. It's really painful for those who are affected by it. And I'm sure no one enjoyed the journey at UWA. I'm absolutely certain about that. But when you step back and look at the long term, you know, good things sometimes happen, come out of that. All I'm saying, it's a really tough predicament to be in. But it's a privilege when you get it right. Those few moments in a day when you say, I got this right and I got this wrong, that's the joy. And that's a massive responsibility, and it's not easy. But, you know, I feel I'm a sociologist. You know, that's my background. It's, I love reading, I love thinking, I love discussing, and so on. We need to protect that, and we need to safeguard that in our institutions. How we do that, that's a magic, quite frankly, because it depends on all those different factors that sometimes my dear colleagues in HASS disciplines don't see. But we try our best. So anyway, long question to a very good question. A long answer to a very good question.
Some of my other colleagues, I feel like we can't give the question. Of course, the last question in a HASS panel, it has to be about revolution. That's the rule. But I feel like we should not give the last answer to the VC on a question on our panel. So, I agree. Anyone else from the panel have any thoughts?
No, I just think we are a university sector in a state of flux, and I'm not sure where it will go. But yeah, and I think the earlier question from the gentleman there, the humanities and social sciences, we have to be a bit more savvy if we're actually going to really, and it's vital that we do. It's not just about us. It's vital for our society that we do. And I think we spend too much time looking at ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. And I think, you know, one point that you mentioned we might talk about that we didn't really cover was, I suppose, the role of impact and the impact agenda. And I mean, I personally think it's great that there's a lot more discussion around impact and engagement, but I also think that kind of labour needs to be better and more formally recognised and rewarded as a kind of form of labour and skill set within universities. Rather than just kind of something extra that needs to be done on top of everything else. So I think we need to kind of have a bigger conversation about like what is academic labour, what it includes, what it doesn't include, how it's measured and rewarded, what does knowledge creation look like, what form does that take? I think that's a really key to these bigger questions we've been discussing.
Larissa, any final
Well,
words?
I mean, the impact agenda, yes. I mean, I think this gets back to the storytelling. I think this is we could see this as a fantastic opportunity to try and do different types of storytelling, because we do have the tools on hand, the techniques, the methods, etc., to try and actually give some voice to that messiness of the social and the cultural and the environmental. And so it could be a really great opportunity, but it does involve a lot of invisible labour that, you know, means that we need the systems to change. So it's kind of pertinent that we've got the ARC doing that review of era, and, you know, so that maybe also with the engagement and impact that could be, you know, we don't want to go down like how the UK went, where it's like done it in such a way
I
that
bet we do.
I'll try, we try, but you know, I think you're probably right, Maggie, sorry, but yeah.
Well,
no, but,
maybe, yeah, let's hope we don't, so we
Yes.
can finish on
yes.
well, I think
It's
one
an
of the things we
opportunity.
can do as HASS disciplines is point out the multiple and varied ways we can be a resource for the communities we serve and we're part of, academic communities and non-academic communities. And that's the benefit, not just for HASS, but for the whole university, to think more broadly and capaciously about that. We're running out of time, and thank you everyone for lasting to the end. You know, thank you. We've heard so much about how the tools and resources we need are here, but we don't always tell the story and maybe work collectively to do it. This Congress has been an example of when we can. 22 associations have been part of this. And that's a big undertaking to do something different. So a shout out to all those associations who took part. I have to also give a shout out to the supporters, the University of Melbourne and the Faculty of Arts for hosting us, the Melbourne Convention Bureau, Melbourne Humanities Foundation, Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and Future Leaders sponsored us. Thank you to all our participants. That was a wonderful conversation. Last weekend, many days ago, when we started this, at the opening, I said, this is like when people ask you if you could have a dinner party and invite anyone in the world, living or dead, you know, that kind of thing, that I felt like it was almost the panel I'd pick. We had a committee that worked on this, but I felt like I got some of my faves in the end. And this is felt like one of the best dinner party conversations I could imagine. But it is almost really time for dinner and drinks. And I know for many of us here, particularly, as well as thanking the organising committee that had reps from all the participants and you all for being part of it. As president of CHAS, I did want to give a big shout out to our executive officer, Sally Daly. She's been here, just before you give her a clap, I think, just hold on, I want to say, she's been here at about 6:30 every day, almost since last Friday, and here till late into the evening. So it's been a really big endeavour to make it all happen. So thank you to the CHAS board for backing this idea, but particularly to Sally, our executive officer. Thank you to my amazing dinner party guests and conversationalists, and thank you to you all. And just as we finish, I wanted to say also a preemptive thank you to the Faculty of Arts at the University of Sydney. Lisa Atkins-Zedine has agreed to host the second Congress of the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences next year. So everyone have a good rest, and I'll see you hopefully in 2023.
In my lesson, I said that.